Flood hazard is a huge problem in California Central Valley. I've talked about that in some other videos. It's a problem here in the valley. It could be a problem in the Bay Area as well. Many of our communities are hugely impacted by flood hazards. You know, some of them are protected by levees, like my hometown of Stockton is protected by levees, but levees aren't perfect. They break, they leak. So flood risk is a huge deal. So governments, lenders, and insurance companies are becoming more and more restrictive about the types of land development they'll allow you to do in a floodplain. So, you know, you've got to elevate your structures, you've got to build flood protection systems, you have to come in and raise the existing ground surface. That can be really expensive. Sometimes they just won't let you build, period. It doesn't matter what you do. So that can obviously have major impacts if you're a real estate developer or land real estate investor or land developer. I talked about in another video an example we had in Stockton. The lady's house burned down, and she couldn't pull a building permit because she was in a flood zone that didn't have a base flood elevation determined. And the city was like, "Sorry, yeah, we know you're making a payment on that property, but we're not going to let you build because we don't know where the floodplain's at." Yeah, that was a bum deal. That was a really tough situation. So the other challenge we have is, you know, the FEMA's flood maps, they're not always super accurate. Sometimes they can be really bad. And that's not a criticism of FEMA. You know, people don't understand how hugely expensive it would be to provide accurate flood maps all over the United States. That would be a huge cost. That, you know, there's a limit to what the taxpayer will pay. And at some point FEMA says, hey, if you want to develop land or you want to pull structures out of the floodplain, you're going to have to pay for that work. We're not going to make we're going to do our best guess at where the flood zone is. And if you don't think we're right, then you're going to have to spend some of your own money to show us that we're wrong. And that's how the system has been set up. And the maps are old. I was working on a project over in the coast of California, and the flood map was old. It was old. I don't know. It was 50 years old or 60 years old. They were on an old vertical datum. And, you know, the maps are old. Conditions on the ground change. You know, our weather's changing. It's tough. It's a tough deal. So because of map inaccuracies, you know, FEMA knows their maps aren't perfect. And so because they know the maps are inaccurate, they have a process to remove structures or portions of land that were incorrectly in a floodplain. They've got a process to pull them out of the floodplain. And that is, FEMA calls that a LOMA. That's one of the processes. LOMA is an abbreviation. It's an acronym. It stands for Letter of Map Amendment. And so what is a LOMA? A LOMA is a special application to correct a flood map. It's where you go to FEMA and you say, FEMA, we think you're wrong. We don't think this building is in the floodplain, or we don't think this parcel is in the floodplain. And here's our survey that we got, or our flood study that we paid for, and we would like you to correct the map and pull us out of the flood zone. So that's what a letter of map amendment is. And then in some cases, a LOMA may require an elevation certificate. So what's an elevation certificate? I want you to understand the difference. An elevation certificate is a special form that a surveyor fills out to establish the elevation of a structure. So if you're trying to pull a structure out of a floodplain, you may have to do an elevation certificate and submit that with your letter of map amendment application, a LOMA. Okay, so when do you need a LOMA? You need a LOMA if you're trying to pull a building or a portion of a parcel outside of a floodplain. That's when you need a LOMA. Pretty simple. There are three important things, though, that you need to remember if you're going to hire a land surveyor to prepare a LOMA application. And they almost always have to be prepared by a land surveyor. In some states, they can be done by a civil engineer or an architect, but most places they need to be prepared by a land surveyor. Don't hire an architect to do your LOMA. I love architects, but they shouldn't be doing LOMAs. Hire a land surveyor to do your LOMA. So, three things I want you to remember when you hire a land surveyor to do a LOMA. Number one, the land surveyor can't guarantee that your LOMA will be approved. He just doesn't know. It's up to FEMA. It's up to the local flood management officials. He can do the best he can to prepare your application, but he can't make you a promise. And he doesn't know what he's going to find. And if the structure's under the BFE, under the base flood elevation, he's not going to be able to help you. Now, there may be other things you can do. You might be able to flood-proof the structure or elevate it or do some other things, but most surveyors are not going to lie on a LOMA application to pull your structure out of the flood zone. So, just remember, you can hire a surveyor to do a LOMA, but he can't guarantee the result. Second, the land surveyor has to do some initial work before he can prepare a LOMA. And that initial work includes a field survey. So he's got to get out on the ground and establish some elevations and look at the topography. And he may do that initial work and then come back and tell you, you're under the BFE. There's no way I can pull you out. I can't do a LOMA. So that money that you spend on his initial or her initial work, that's at-risk money. You might lose it. You might spend it and realize he can't help you. You know, I wish there was something different. I wish it was different. I wish we didn't have to do that as surveyors, but that is the reality. We have to charge you for some upfront work before we know if we can pull you out of the zone. Almost all the time. There are a few cases where we may be able to look because we've done some previous work in the area, or it's just so clear cut we can look at something and say, no, we can pull you out of the zone. We still got to do the survey because FEMA wants us to prove it, but there are a lot of cases where it's a gray area and we don't know until we do our initial field work. Number 3, oftentimes getting the approval of the LOMA will involve talking to your local floodplain officials, not just FEMA. So the actual flood insurance program is run or administered at the local level by your local government agency. Could be your public works department, could be your building department. There's an official there that manages the floodplain in your community, and as part of the LOMA, we got to get buy-off from the local floodplain folks, and we need to be having some conversations with them. So, you know, if you've been fighting with the building department, that could potentially cause some heartache. So it's not just FEMA. You've got to work with your local agencies too to get your approvals on your LOMA. So remember those 3 things. Okay, the last question I want to just touch on is how much should a LOMA cost? A lot of real estate folks will tell you, a real estate agent will tell you, oh, LOMA should be $500. They're not $500. If you got somebody doing a LOMA for $500, you need to ask questions. They might be committing fraud. You can't do a good LOMA for $500. So how much should a LOMA cost? Well, it depends, like a lot of different things in land surveying and real estate. It depends on some different factors. So what I want to do is give you some factors and I give you some ballpark costs. Okay. So here's some things you got to look at when you price a LOMA. If you call me and ask for a LOMA, I have to look at some things to give you a price. So how old's the FEMA flood map? How accurate do I think it is? And usually we can get an idea. Land surveyors get an idea. How many structures need to be surveyed? The last LOMA I did, there was 3 different structures, four different structures we had to survey on one piece of property. Okay? Every structure needs its own elevation certificate, right? So that adds to the cost. What type of structures are they? You know, if you got a 4-sided pole barn, that's pretty easy. If you've got a 8-bedroom, 3-level custom home on a hillside, that's going to take a lot more time. It's a different form. You know, we have to use different types of building diagrams depending on the type of structure. So I got to look at that. It influences the cost. How do we establish the vertical datum? I know that's a really technical thing for some of you non-surveyors, but you know, all the elevations that we look at, both of the flood waters and of the existing structures, are a reference to what we call a datum. There's different kinds of datums. If it's an older datum, that's going to be more work for me usually. So I need to look at that. I need to look at what kind of vertical datum we need to use. How much land area do we need to survey to determine the boundary of the floodplain? So we don't always have to do that. So if we've got a well-defined channel with some levees, we may not have to do a survey. But in other areas, the floodplain boundaries aren't always well-defined. We have to do a topography survey to figure out where that's at. You know, what are we surveying? Are we surveying an acre or 100 acres? That makes a big difference, right? What's the terrain like? Is it heavily forested and steep? You know, is it wide open? All those things are going to impact the cost of the survey. Another factor we look at is, do we have to calculate a BFE? So some flood zones, they will have a published BFE. Other flood zones don't. Sometimes you have to interpolate or calculate your own BFE. So we need to look at that. That's more work if we have to calculate a BFE. And then then another thing we need to look at is if you're doing a LOMA because you want to develop land, there's some extra requirements that could get triggered depending on how big it is, how many parcels it is, how many acres it is. You might actually have to hire a civil engineer to do a private flood study, and that is very expensive. In California, at least as a land surveyor, I can't do a flood study. We have to hire a civil engineer for that. And I don't want architects and civils doing LOMAs. I don't want land surveyors doing flood studies. I don't think they should be doing flood studies. I don't know enough about hydraulics. So those are all factors that we have to look at. How many things did I just read off? There were 7 things. You know, there was a bunch. So that's why I can't just give you a blanket price, you know, unit cost. Oh, well, almost $1,200. Well, it depends. So let me give you some ranges, okay? Simple case. Simple 4-sided home, 5-sided home, or a barn, let's say. We know where the floodplain's at. It's got a well-defined boundary. We've got a published BFE. I got to do a day of field work, fill some paperwork out in the office. $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 maybe. Okay, to get you a LOMA. That's the best case scenario. Because nowhere near $500. Okay, let's look at a more complicated scenario. Let's say we got a 100-acre parcel. The floodplain is not well defined, so I got to do a topography survey. It's heavily treed, so I got to do a lot of ground surveys to get the topography defined. We got to do some interpolation of the BFE because we're on a creek with some fall to it, so it's not a consistent BFE. It's a sloped floodplain. We got to do some of that analysis. We've got, let's say, half a dozen structures on this 100-acre parcel that we got to pull out. Each of those might need an EC. Now you might be 10 grand, 15 grand, 20 grand, right? Let's say you're doing a land development project. You want to do, you're going to take that 100 acres and you're going to develop it. You're going to put on 50 homes. If you don't have a BFE, now you might need a flood study, private flood study. You got to hire a civil engineer. We got to go do cross sections. That could be $50,000 or $100,000. Okay, so that'll give you some rough ranges. But I want you guys to know, what's a LOMA? When do you need one? Roughly how much does it cost, right? You need a LOMA when you're trying to pull stuff out of the flood zone. LOMAs are expensive. They're not a few $100s, they're a few $1,000s at least. Hire a good surveyor, understand your flood risk. If a surveyor can pull you out of the flood zone, that might save your development project, might save you a lot of money on flood insurance. So you got to do the cost-benefit analysis, right? Look at what the cost of a LOMA is. You can call my office. We'll give you a rough idea, without charging you. We'll talk to you for a little bit and take a look at some satellite photography and tell you ballpark what we think it might cost. You got to look at that and weigh that against the benefits, right? If it allows you to build where you couldn't build, or it allows you to pull a building out of the flood zone and way drop your flood insurance rates, then the cost might be worth it. So hire a good surveyor, have them take care of your LOMA.